Greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Lina Soares. I'm a professor in the College of Education at Georgia Southern University. Georgia Southern University is part of the University of Georgia system, the state of Georgia, USA. And I'm speaking with you this morning from historic Savannah, Georgia. And I'm very, very happy to talk about something that's extremely important to me, that's kind of been the focus of my teaching in higher education, as well as my research interest. And so the title of the presentation, Enhancing Critical Stance with Young Adult Literature, Research, Theory, and Practice, is going to focus basically on two topics. One, how I teach critical stance, and then I'm going to share with you some research that I have actually conducted that examines critical stance. Okay, so to begin, so what is critical stance? Well, it's the deliberate position that a reader takes to read in opposition to text, to question the construction of text, and then also how the reader is influenced during the reading. Okay, so moving on, we can actually say that critical stance is the third continuum in reading stance. So, consulting back to Rosenblatt's 1970 seminal work, she acknowledged that a transaction occurs between the reader and the text. In other words, as the reader is reading and taking in the words and looking for the meaning, the reader is actually engaged with the text, and it consists of two forms of response. Now I'm quoting. So the efferent stance pays more attention to the cognitive, the referential, the factual, if you will. And then the aesthetic stance, this is Rosenblatt's work, pays more attention to the sensuous, the affective, the emotive, the qualitative. However, in 2004, McLaughlin and Good offered that there is a third stance, the critical stance. In other words, readers use their background knowledge, their lived experiences, to understand the relationships between their own ideas and the ideas presented by the author of the text. This is what Luke and Freebody, and they are well-known researchers in the field of critical literacy. This is what they say, that readers play the role not only of code breakers or meaning makers and text users, but they also become text critics. In other words, readers have the power to envision alternate ways of viewing these authors' words, and they exert that power by reading from a critical stance, peeling away what's going on in a particular text, if you will. Okay, so how do we promote critical stance? Well, the term critical literacy is a pedagogical approach to reading that focuses on the political, social, cultural, historical, and then economic forces that shape readers' lives. Critical literacy is defined by articulating the principles of power that promote reflection, transformation, and action on part of the reader. McLaughlin and de Gavood explained how critical literacy takes readers beyond comprehension to higher levels of reasoning about what they read. So let me stop there. In other words, as teachers, we have often taught students to extract the meaning from the text. But in this situation, readers imbue meaning from the text or imbue meaning to the text because they are bringing in their own background and lived experiences. And as they're reading, they're interacting and they're questioning and they're wondering, whose version of reality? What is this author trying to tell me? So those are some of the interactions, if you will, that critical literacy promotes that can bring about that critical stance. In 2015, Comer offered that the goals are to encourage students to ask why things are the way they are, to analyze what is going on in their world, to question who benefits from the way things are, and then to act on the belief of making things more equitable. So in other words, critical literacy has an agentive piece to it. All right? And then, of course, FRERE, critical literacy enables students to read, to recognize the injustices, and to rewrite, to transform the world through collective action against dominant and oppressive forces. All right, so moving on, reading the world as word. To read the world as the word, adolescents need opportunities to engage in critical discussions that center on the relevant issues in their lives. Time to critique and reflect on those issues and relate the issues to the world at large. So, young adult books can enable adolescents to relate to their immediate world as struggles with identity, peer pressure, and conflicts. These are just some of the themes that I've listed here. There are so many more issues that are going on in adolescents' lives. Likewise, pre-service teachers who will one day teach these adolescents can benefit when given opportunities to analyze books that explore the social, cultural, and political dimensions that influence their lives. And I should also offer that influences, again, the lives of the students with whom they will one day teach. Research has shown that young adult literature, even controversial young adult literature, supports critical literacy in middle and secondary classroom. Okay, so what are the guiding principles for those of you who teach or are thinking about using critical literacies to promote critical stance? First of all, your classroom is viewed as a society. Literature is viewed as a space for constructing critical discourse or conversations. Texts are to be interrogated. They are never neutral. Comprehension takes a critical stance, and meaning is coming to know how the political, social, cultural, and historical forces impact students' lives. That's why dialogue is extremely important. And learning is a social act. It's tied to real life, and it relies on language as a mediator. Okay, so how do I teach critical literacy in order to develop critical stance? A few years back, I discovered an instructional model that consisted of 5 themes to promote critical literacy. The first theme is on multiple perspectives. The second one is finding one's authentic voice. The third one is recognizing social barriers and crossing borders of separation. The fourth one is regaining one's identity. And the fifth one is civic responsibility. Okay, so I'm going to take some time to talk to you about how I teach my students each of those 5 themes. Okay, so what I do is that I also use these questions to promote critical literacy so that while I'm reading and modeling and thinking out loud with my students, these are questions that I use. By all means, these questions can be used with print as well as non-print literature as well. You know that we live in a digital age and many of our students are digital natives. So these are questions. So if you look, whose view of the world is put forth? What kinds of social realities does this text portray? How far do you accept the text or the author's position? These are all outstanding questions to promote critical literacy. Okay, so now moving into the first theme of multiple perspectives. In other words, this theme is all about that text can have multiple meanings that are based on various viewpoints and personal values. So one of the things that I do is to introduce this idea of multiple perspectives through personal stories and picture books. In other words, I talk with my students about personal events that can occur in their own families and what are those different perspectives that each family member can present. And also picture books and children books. So as I've said, have a critical conversation related to the different viewpoints about particular issues in one family. So in other words, you want to point out that the same event can be viewed in different ways by different participants and observers. And then I also like to engage students in different reading that relate to critical conversations. Now, I've only provided for example, one book that I often use, and this is The Day of Tears by Julius Lester. And as I told you, I'm now speaking to you from Savannah, Georgia. And many students do not know that the largest slave auction in U.S. history occurred right here in historic Savannah, Georgia. And so this particular text examines all the individual voices of those who were involved that particular day of the auction, such as the adults and even kids that were in attendance, the slaves for sale, the auctioneer, and the white masters and their families. So the whole reason why I use this is to introduce my students to that theme of multiple perspectives. And that particular event is going to have many different perspectives that occurred on that particular day. All right, so extensions that I have used with my students is for them to research current events with contrasting perspectives, to research an issue of injustice that is important, and then write a letter to the editor or opinion forum. I've had my students create a reader's theater from the perspective of a slave owner, and an abolitionist. I've also shown the film, The Outsiders, which is a great film to show the perspectives between the Soch and the Greasers. So this is a film that really looks at the haves and the have-nots in a town. Then I've had them also view the film To Kill a Mockingbird. And we discuss the different viewpoints and perspectives in the courtroom. What we do is we analyze the mob mentality, and then we determine really who is the real mockingbird in that particular film and also in that text. And these are some other ideas that bring silent voices of fear, prejudice, class, and racism to the forefront, because that is the whole idea of examining multiple perspectives, is that you want your students to forefront those social injustices. So, of course, the Holocaust in our country, the Native American impact during the westward expansion. Also, again, in our country, the interned Japanese Americans in World War II, who were rounded up because they were Japanese and America was at war with Japan. The civil rights, women's rights, the migrant workers issues, and child labor. These are just some topics that will really present different perspectives for students to begin to examine. Moving on to the next theme, the theme of finding authentic voice. The concept of voice refers to the ability to express freely without worry of power or social position. Okay, so once again, I like to introduce the idea of voice by engaging students in critical questions to elicit discourse. Okay, and some questions that are especially fun to have with pre-service teachers, since I'm in higher education, is to ask them, has there ever been a time in their family where they had the power to make a family decision? All right, here's another question. I ask my students, do you have the power to discuss a bad grade with your professor? Or do you have the power to engage a traffic officer for a speeding ticket? I promise you, those types of questions allows them to exercise their voice, and they don't even realize that they are exercising their voice. But through those discussions, they begin to realize the imbalance of power in those conversations. All right, and so for fun, because I think I mentioned that I also like to use picture books and children's literature. And so one of the great books, children's literature of all time, is Click, Clack, Moo, Cows That Type. Okay, so I read this aloud, and once again, I ask those questions that I showed you a while ago, questions that prompt and promote critical literacy. So I have the students identify the dominant voice of Farmer Brown. I help my students through my question to see how Farmer Brown tries to silence his farm animals' request for electric heaters. Essentially, this is what this little children's book is about. Farm animals, very cold, in a barn. And then I help my students lead the students to see what animals have to do to overcome the authority of Farmer Brown. And I emphasize how the animals exercise their own authentic voices to gain those haters in the barn. That's just one example of a piece of text that I have used with my students to give them an idea of what we mean by authentic voice. And so moving on, the theme of recognizing social barriers. Okay. Introduce the concepts that harmful assumptions and negative stereotypes establish social barriers. In other words, borders of separation are an antithesis to democracy, and I'm all about promoting democracy in the classroom, to value all my students, to value their voices, and to make them feel that they are valid members of our society, and our society is the classroom. Okay, and I talk to them how many are excluded by race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, economic status. We talk about and we discuss the ideas of otherness and sameness. And we talk about, and I question, how do stereotypes exclude many in society? All the while, these are not just questions that I'm talking. These lead to critical conversations. This is allowing my students to enter into criticality, if you will. And so I often use these types of questions to elicit discourse. Who is missing from this picture, event, or experience? Once again, you can use picture books. You can use events from history, current events, experience from text that you read, experiences from movies that they see. And then we talk about how do different groups, such as social, ethnic, racial, feel about whatever particular topic of social injustice that you have chosen. And then what are some different reasons for the different income levels that exist. Okay, so one of the books that I use to demonstrate crossing a border, crossing the social barrier, is the story of Ruby Bridges, and we examine the courage of one young child to overcome hate and bigotry and enter an all-white elementary school. This was a story that was written during time of deep segregation in the South, in the United States. Okay, then the theme of regaining one's identity. All right, it's important for people to realize that a person's identity is shaped by different ideological systems. So the goal is to provide students with deliberate tools to overcome the barriers and to find one sense of agency or their true identity. So here are some other questions that I often discuss with my students to elicit discourse. Is identity how we define ourselves or how others define us? And is it the same? What group do you associate yourself with and why? Consider all the roles they may identify with different facets of their lives, such as their roles at school, their roles in home, or their roles with their peers, their roles within society. And begin by asking if any of your students have been made fun of because of skin color, hair color, or the way they dressed. Okay. Ask students to discuss in what ways they have been the object of another student's ridicule. These are questions and these are discussion prompts that have allowed me to help my students take on and understand what we mean about a student's or a person's true identity. So, one of the books that I often use, again, is a children's book, Chrysanthemum. It's an adorable story. It's an excellent story. Also, Chrysanthemum is mercilessly teased by a group of nasty young mice at school, all because of her name, until she is cast as the star in a musical play. And it is through this, when she becomes a star, that she recaptures and she regains her identity, and she is no longer ashamed of her name, and she no longer worries about what group she's in because she has discovered her true identity. All right, now, then the fifth theme is the call to service. Critical literacy does promote agency. It does have an agentive part of it. In other words, it's one thing to just identify the injustices, but it's another thing to take action. So in other words, in order to read the word and the world, students need to become civically competent, understanding and applying moral and civic responsibilities to promote a democratic understanding. This is the agentive action promoted by critical literacy. And a book I believe that most everybody knows is the book Wonder, and it's a story about a boy with a serious facial deformity. I read this book so that my students can examine who are the characters in the story who are mean, but more importantly, to examine the students who take action to become Augie's friends. Now, the extension to this, often we discuss service needs in class and explain about the multiple ways that we can bring to help. We write letters to our community service organizations asking how your class or my class may be of help. We view films, documentaries, and commercials about service, and we've even interviewed town leaders to determine area needs, then plan a classroom project to address one of the needs. Okay, all right. I told you that I was going to share a piece of research that I have actually conducted. So this was called Powerful Words and Pens, Developing Critical Stance with Adolescent Literacy in Pre-Service Teacher Education. So this brings about really my real love, helping pre-service teachers enter into criticality using adolescent literacy in order to help them develop a critical stance. So the purpose of the research was twofold: to explore how the environment of literature circles with the infusion of critical literacy practices provide opportunities for pre-service teachers to engage in critical stance. Okay, the second purpose was to explore how pre-service teachers engage in critical stance during situated reading practices that centered on discussions of young adult literature. Okay, so what was the rationale for this? Okay, if pre-service teachers were ever going to engage their own students one day in critical conversations that address the relevant social issues and to understand how their future students perceive their world, then an alternative to the textbook is needed. In this country, there is an over-reliance on textbooks, even though we have multiple research studies that show that students should be exposed to multiple forms of reading, but there is a preponderance on textbooks. Okay, and I just happen to be an advocate of introducing my pre-service teachers to those multiple forms of reading. What we also know, and research has shown, that one such method that holds promise is to expose pre-service teachers to the prominent themes offered in young adult literature, because those prominent themes relate and apply to their own lives, but to their future students' lives and to the communities in which they will one day teach. So the two research questions that guided this study: how does the environment of literature circles with infusion of critical literacy perspective provide opportunities for pre-service teachers to engage in critical discussion? And how do pre-service teachers engage in critical stance during the situated reading practices that centered on those discussions of young adult literature? Okay. The conceptual framework actually involved three different theories. And Eisenhower in 1991 offered that a conceptual framework is often composed of multiple theories that are brought together by research in an attempt to address the research problem and to serve as a framework for gathering the data and analyzing and explaining. Sometimes it takes more than one particular theory in order to answer those research questions. So, social constructivism critical transformational theory, and transactional theory of reader response provided the framework for the particular research. The study was conducted over the course of one university semester in the southeastern region of the United States. It involved 14 pre-service teachers who were enrolled in a language arts and social studies instructional methods class. The class met twice a week for a 3-hour period, each class meeting. And during class meeting, the students participated in literature circle book discussions in order to put research into practice. For purposes of this study, the developing student teachers enacted typical procedures that are common for literature circle discussions. However, 2 different roles for those of you who are familiar with literature circles were developed because I developed a matrix and found that the typical roles that are used in literature circle or book discussions by Daniels did not delve really into critical literacy, and so I developed the character investigator and the character profiler, in addition to using the director, the literacy illuminator, the wordsmith connector. Those were the roles that the students took on during their literature circle discussions. Okay, and the 2 young adult texts that we used, I used The Hunger Games, and I also used The Breadwinner. I will not read this aloud to you. These are texts that are used in almost every middle and secondary classroom in the United States. And as while I'm talking, you might be thinking about texts that you would use that you're more familiar with, and not just always the texts that I'm talking about. Please keep in mind these are texts that I have used. Okay, so the quantitative data collection and analysis. Data were collected on pre and post study student responses from the literary response questionnaire. The survey data collected to indicate how the undergraduate middle education majors view the socio-cultural influences in the text, and then how they position, what stance they take or they took during their reading. The LRQ consisted of 68 items, and they are positively worded, and they provide Likert scale items that range from not at all true to extremely true. Okay? The internal consistency reliability for the survey items was determined by computing the alpha coefficient was found to be 0.714. The LRQ was administered the first and last weeks of the semester, so it was a pre and post survey that I administered. And then after that, a paired sample t-test was then conducted to determine what effect does critical literacy have on pre-service teachers' abilities to understand how their attitudes and beliefs are shaped by what they read. All right, because I also had a qualitative research question, the data was collected by field notes and anecdotal records that I took while the students were in class. I conducted formal and informal conversations with the students through interviews. I videotaped and audiotaped their literature circle discussions using electronic means. I observed, and then the data were analyzed according to the prescribed coding methods that follow the typical protocol of grounded theory. In other words, I began with a 3-level process of open coding, axial coding, and selective coding to identify the patterns, the various categories, and the themes of the data that emerged. So the quantitative results. The results from the paired sample t-test showed there was a statistically significant difference between the pre-test and the post-test. The results suggest that strategic practices in critical literacy have an effect on pre-service teachers' abilities to understand how their attitudes and beliefs are shaped by what they read. In addition, the effect size indicates the difference in the 2 beings was larger than 1 standard deviation. The qualitative results from using inductive coding and from conducting the forms of grounded theory, the principles of grounded theory, I found that the combination of the young adult literature and the social learning environment promoted inquiry and critical discussions. From this perspective, so both the text And then the social contexts of the literature circles were found to be the cultural tools for establishing those critical conversations. Two themes emerged, as core domains or major categories to support this founding. So, that powerful words were created through critical conversations, and then powerful pens created counter text. Okay, so what happened? Powerful words created critical conversations. Through the literature circle discussions, by using their voices, the power discussion, the pre-service teachers demonstrated critical stance. They were found to reposition. They assumed new reading identities in order to understand the textual world in relation to their world. They challenged the text. They challenged the imbalance of power and its effect on the characters in the text. They exercised their agency through their voices and the choices to peel back the layers of social injustices. So in other words, the verbal participation was significant in the context of social interaction, since it was the social interaction that put into use the literate practices that are associated with reading from a critical stance. In other words, the students learned and developed the tendency to question and write about and to talk about what kinds of texts, whose interests are served, whose voices are silent. Examine the power differential between the dominant and the non-dominant groups and determine how both groups were situated within the text power structure. They sought to foreground those differences and view the text from alternative perspectives. They took on the characters' experiences and feelings such that empathy was endorsed, but the imbalance of power in the text was not diminished. Powerful pens created counter texts. Through writing, pre-service teachers challenged and they resisted the dominant voices, countered by writing that membership is a non-dominant group often translates into a lack of privilege. And specifically, the pre-service teachers produced countertext by using their pen through dialogue dialogue journaling to become agents of social change. Okay, this is an example of one of the students positioning in the Hunger Games. This is students writing. The author has presumably chosen to tell this text from an impoverished people's point of view, possibly to exaggerate what happens when the government turns on its people. The author's interest in this story is to lead readers to view the social class stratification that exists in the text world is similar to the real world. Since society consists of the haves and have-nots, I believe the author wanted us to sympathize with the have-nots, to understand their daily struggles to survive. The fact that Panem is divided into districts by class is to remind readers that our neighborhoods are divided by social class much the same way. The author has positioned readers to accept that society is distorted when members of the lower class are weak, and when they disobey, they can be destroyed through competitive games. All right, so another episode that I have provided, alternative ways to view the bread winter. This is from one of my students. Parvana's mother continues to write about the underground newspaper. An underground newspaper defies the Taliban law, and this perspective cannot be overlooked because there were instances in this book where women would not be silenced. Women are often portrayed to be the weaker sex, but from reading this book, I find it was the women and girls who fought the power of the Taliban in their own way, such as Parvana cutting her hair and dressing as a boy, the mother in the newspaper, and the sister in her school. Parvana's sister deliberately holds school for girls, and her action reveals that people who individually went against the rule of the Taliban. I applaud what the women and girls did behind the scenes to fight the oppression. I have never sold bones to survive, but I see Parvana's fight for survival as her means to fight for freedom. Freedom is a human right. So in conclusion, this study found that discussion that centered on controversial young adult literature became a powerful tool for pre-service teachers to assume a critical stance. As the pre-service teachers engaged in reading and discussing texts that were heavily laden with issues of power, gender equality, poverty, and death, critical conversations grew into sharper focus. The social venue of literature circles became a site for critical conversations. Both the text and the social context were found to be tools that permitted the pre-service teachers to discover how the power of words can enact critical stance. Additionally, the study found that dialogue journaling became a powerful tool to engage in critical stance. By using their pens, the pre-service teachers extended their critical conversations from interaction in the classroom by recording multiple perspectives that allowed them to view the text from alternative voices. In closing, thank you very much. I hope this has been something of interest to you. Thank you, folks.